Hey, it's your boy Tamonster back with another review. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance is overrated. Don't let those 90s fool you. That's just nostalgia talking. I recently played this title after completing the surprisingly stellar Circle of the Moon as part of my retrospective review of the Castlevania Advance Collection. I had high hopes for this title going in based on the previous entry, and as you can probably tell from my tone, it doesn't quite live up to the heights of its predecessor. It's not necessarily a bad game though. Like all Castlevania titles, there's lots of love here, so let's just get into it. Probably have the least to say about the story, so let me stick that in here real quick. The story is fine. It features a Belmont and a Dracula fight. What more do you want? You basically run into a castle after your friend Maxim. Turns out he's been possessed by Dracula at some point, and you free him. Pretty straightforward. So let's get back to the music. The music is good. Nothing detracts from the gameplay, and the sound effects are on point. Using magic is a big part of this title, and all the hit effects are very satisfying to hear. The music does cut out in cutscenes like in Circle of the Moon, but the dialogue boxes still have sound effects, so it loses that awkward dead silence that was in Circle of the Moon. And there are many set pieces in the game with plenty diegetic sound effects to complement the scenes. For example, when an armored giant falls into a bunch of gears and gets crushed, there's nice complementary sound effects there that really immerse you into the world. As a whole, it is an improvement to the sound from Circle of the Moon. Whether or not you find the individual music tracks better than Circle of the Moon is obviously a matter of opinion, but I'd say its use of sound is far superior. So let's move on to the visuals. Personally, the visuals in this game are a mixed bag to me. Like any Castlevania title, there are tons of recognizable enemies with a unique spin on their designs just for this title. Many of these enemies didn't appear in the last game, so there's no noticeable asset flip situations in the previous game, and I was happy to see that. I'd say about 90% of the enemies look better than Circle of the Moon, and they have gorgeous animations that pair with their threatening looking attacks. Sometimes I just run up on them and wait for them to do their attacks just to see what kind of cool tricks they'd pull out of their bag. Some of the death animations are also very well executed and always interesting to look at. I think the visual design really shines with the many unique bosses and giant enemies that show up throughout the castle. These enemies have a level of detail that I'd expect from a Castlevania title. They inspire unease when facing them in combat. They add to the macabre atmosphere the Castlevania titles are known for. And again, while I'd say 90% of the designs are a noted improvement, there are at least 10% of the monster designs that are questionable. I think the biggest offenders I'll point out are the ectoplasms and the bats. Harmony's taken a design of the ectoplasm used in older titles that is a lot smaller and almost looks pixelated in comparison to the detail of the other enemies. I found them kind of out of place when compared to the level of details you'll find in some of the other common monsters. If they didn't place ectoplasms in a room with other more detailed creatures, maybe it wouldn't stand out as much, but they definitely don't hold up where they are. The other big offender is the bats. The bats are sparsely used, but they have a very bright, distracting blue outline that makes them seem wholly separate from the castle. I have no idea what possessed them to keep this design, but even a cursory glance, and I'm sure you'll agree it just looks off. I can guess this was made to make the bat stand out on a screen that possibly isn't backlit, so you aren't being unfairly attacked by an enemy you can't perceive. However, the bats were so scarcely used that I don't understand why they would make this decision. It's really baffling. With so many enemies in the game, there's probably one or two other offenders, but those were just the most distracting in my run. But let's talk about another character with a distractingly blue outline, our protagonist, Juste Belmont. Or Justy? I don't know, I'm gonna say Juste, don't come for me. The blue outline surrounding Juste is probably the first thing you're going to notice. It's weird, and the reasons for its existence are never really made apparent. Much like I said for the bats, it could be that they wanted the character to stand out on a console that isn't backlit, but it's a design choice that I don't think has aged particularly well. It's not really going to bother you for more than 30 minutes of the playthrough, because the game will give you a lot more to think about after a while, like while you're still playing, but it's still worth noting. Juste's animations are smooth enough, but I think you'll agree that the sprite does bear some similarities to another popular protagonist, Alucard. I'm talking about Alucard. Granted, basing your title off of one of the coolest Castlevania avatars doesn't sound like the worst idea. It's just, there's one problem. Alucard's a vampire, and all of the traits that they're aping for Juste make literally no sense. Alucard has white hair with his young face to invoke an inhuman agelessness and mysticism associated with vampirism. Juste is a young man from a bloodline of blonde and brown-haired men. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for him to have white hair. Alucard makes afterimages from his dashes as a representation of his vampiric speed to give Juste the same afterimages as a human. Again, just creates more questions than I think they intended. And the only answer, just like his red cloak, that I can think of is that it's derivative. To be clear, it's not a bad design. It's just, I'm disappointed it didn't take a bigger risk at making something more original, or at least more human-inspired, instead of invoking a half-vampire like they did. So let's take a look at the other human character you interact with in the story, Maxim. You'll notice a glowing red border around him as well. He's a strange European ninja of sorts that throws shurikens and wields quick sword slashes. I would give the design props for not being immediately recognizable as a ripoff of some other character, but it also isn't as iconic as I typically expect Castlevania designs to be. Something about the sprite just looks like it's lacking. I feel like it's missing details, and some of Maxim's attack animations look like they need a second pass to me. For example, his sword slash barely reads as any kind of cutting motion to me. It looks more like they just took the whip animation and removed some frames to make it look more like a sword slash. It's not very convincing. A quick look at the Castlevania wiki tells me that these models may have been scaled down at some point, and that's why they look a little rough compared to the previous title and titles that come after. And that's somewhat believable, but I haven't done any further research to confirm if this is true or not. At the end of the day, I feel the way I feel about these designs. They're a little rough, a little uninspired, but overall, nothing to get super worked up about. But let's get back to the positives of the visuals, and that's the castle the story takes place in. The castle is the main part of the game that makes Harmony of Dissonance truly feel like a sequel to Circle of the Moon. The castle implements so many visual techniques to bring the castle to life. The castle makes use of 3D models, parallaxing layers that give depth to rooms, unique background animations on things like clouds and outdoor spaces, or gimmicks like spinning gears and environments that get changed or destroyed by monsters. All of these additions make this one of the most visually interesting castles I've seen in a Castlevania title, and it deserves much of the praise for making this an enjoyable Castlevania experience. With the side A and B gimmick of this castle, it is important that they make it stand out, since you spend so much time within it, and it almost is a true second protagonist in this game more than other Castlevania titles. And I believe they achieved their goal of making it memorable. So let's transition to gameplay. Let's not beat around the bush. The gameplay of this game is not great and probably the weakest part of this title. I think I'll break this down into talking about two parts, the controls and the general game design. So let's start with the controls. I feel like a lot of strange choices were made with the controls in this game that I don't think are very defensible, given there was nothing wrong with the controls in Circle of the Moon. To start off with, let's talk about the basic attack. This game backtracks on the spinning whip mechanic that I felt was a nice quality of life improvement from previous Castlevania titles. When you hold the attack button in Harmony, you get the classic dangling whip, which you can maneuver around with the gamepad. That doesn't mean that the whip spin is gone though. In this title, they made it an early equipable upgrade, which tells me they recognize its utility, but didn't want you to always have access to it because there are other whip upgrades that you're forced to equip for progression later in the game that incentivizes you to not keep the spin equipped. I think what frustrates me is the acknowledgement that this is an improvement by making it an equipable item, and then fully backpacking on it, not letting you equip it 100% of the time in order to progress the game. And it's like, of course, you can always pause, equip the whip upgrade that you need to equip, and then switch back. But do you really want to do that? So I think that's kind of what I mean by it incentivizes you to not keep it equipped. Because once you get that upgrade that breaks walls, I kind of just kept that equipped so I could keep the game moving. Next, let's look at the jumps. Jumping is a little weird in this game. Compared to Circle of the Moon, you lack a lot of precision air control. Circle of the Moon gave you plenty of air control to adjust your jump arc mid-jump to some degree. Harmony of Dissonance really requires double jump for any adjustments to be made. There are several platforming puzzles and races that I think are made slightly more difficult than they should be because of this lack of air control. There is also a weird choice to make attacks have full commitment during a jump. Let me explain. Once you attack in the air, you can't change the direction you're facing mid-jump nor can you change the jump arc unless you have an unused double jump. This attack commitment doesn't exist in most Castlevania titles from my recent memory, and it serves as an attempt at artificial difficulty to me. I say attempt because this game is actually disgustingly easy, but I'll come back to that. I'll just leave you with this. The main source of damage I experienced in this game was from poorly timed jumps, and it rarely felt like a fair mechanic. The next strange choice that is just weird is the dash buttons. Yes, that's plural. Instead of a single dash button that works based on the context of the direction you're facing, or the direction you're inputting when you press the dash button, like 90% of all games with dash buttons. Harmony of Dissonance has a left dash button on the L button and a right dash button on the R button. I can't explain to you how weird this is. And not only is it a right and left dash button, it's not even contextual to which direction you're facing. So regardless of what direction your character is facing, if you're holding the L button, the character will go left. If you're holding the R button, your character will go right. The animation does change depending on what direction you're facing, but the direction of the dash does not. This is a quirk you will get used to by the end of the game, but just in general, it's a very bad system in my opinion, and a waste of a button. And there's probably a reason I haven't seen this dash system like this in any other game. For veteran players used to dash inputs, this will be another early source of damage for your playthrough until you adjust. The final quirk of the control system I want to touch on is the spell system. Spells are one of the most engaging parts of Harmony of Dissonance. They are incredibly powerful and satisfying to use, and a lot of the fun of this game comes from discovering all the spells by picking up the different weapons and swapping them around with the different spell books to see every possible spell you can use. In Circle of the Moon, toggling your spell on and off so you can use your sub-weapon was mapped to a single press of the left trigger. In Harmony of Dissonance, you can toggle spells on the left trigger as well, but you have to hold left and up to swap spellbooks, and left and down to turn the spellbook off. There's a fundamental problem with this system, and that is that the left trigger is also mapped to a dash. If you mess up the input during a boss fight, you could be dashing right into the hands of the enemy, which feels, again, more like artificial difficulty. If they made the left trigger be a straight toggle like it was in Circle of the Moon, it would be far superior, and you wouldn't be in situations where you're getting accidental dashes where you didn't intend for it. I also have to point out, I missed that toggling was even possible in my run. The input is so obtuse that anytime I stumbled upon it, I thought I had run into a bug and changed it back manually being via the start menu. This game does come from an era where external manuals were a thing, so I can give it a pass if I assume the controls were properly listed in the manual, but I think it goes to show how unintuitive the control scheme actually is from a design standpoint. And while I do want to acknowledge that the controls are a big flaw in this game, there's nothing here that you can't adjust to within, an hour or two of running through this game. So even though I sound pretty negative here, take what I'm saying more as a grain of salt of what your personal experience would be. Watching this video will already prepare you for the quirks of the control, which is more than I had going in, so you may not find this as obtrusive as I did if you've never played the game before. Let's talk about the level design next. Navigating the map is tedious. There's no other way around that. There are a few teleportation locations for a majority of the run, and they are extremely far apart. Getting lost or not knowing exactly where to go is inevitable in a Metroidvania title, but this game's lack of a reasonable amount of teleportation points makes the backtracking feel like unnecessary padding to the runtime. Side A and Side B can also feel disappointingly similar at sometimes. Sometimes the only notable differences are a few different enemies in a room, and with how easy enemies are to defeat, it feels more like set dressing than an actual change. There are points where puzzles are introduced, or little mini challenges, but the most memorable puzzles and challenges tend to be on Side A, which kind of soured me on the gimmick, along with the tedium of traversing between the sides. You must enter portals to switch the castle side you're on, and early portals don't simply swap castles, but they also swap your location, which can make it difficult to figure out how to get to the castle side you desire. Once you unlock the room that shifts the castle without changing location, it gets easier to navigate between the two castles, but it doesn't fully mitigate the issue. Another huge issue to the level design is something I initially thought would be a huge improvement to the game, and that's the shop system. Circle of the Moon had terrible drop rates for items like potions, so I thought an introduction of a shop where items could be bought without worrying about drop rates would be a big improvement, and I was wrong. The shopkeeper has various locations and only shows up at specific times. These times aren't random, but for an average player, they might as well be, because there's nothing in the game to indicate how you get the shop to show up. This leads to seeing a lot of empty rooms, and these rooms are empty because that's where the shopkeeper is supposed to be stationed. Yet, as a player, you don't even know to come back to check this room because there's nothing to indicate that it was a shop unless you're paying like really close attention to how the room looks when the shopkeeper is there. With how easy the game is, figuring out how to make the shopkeeper appear isn't even necessary in the grand scheme of things, and it wasn't fun for me to engage with. So by the time I found the shopkeeper the second time in my run, I had accumulated so much wealth that I just bought as many potions as I needed that time and didn't worry about whether or not he'd be there the next. To 100% the game, you will need to be able to find the shopkeeper though, so keep that in mind if you're a completionist, and there are guides online already with how to make him appear, so I wouldn't spend too much time figuring that out for yourself. But hey, that's up to you. On a more positive note, there were some interesting gimmicks that they implemented with the two-sided castle, like breaking a rock inside B, destroying a standing wall inside A. But on the whole, I feel like it took away more than it added to the gameplay. It just made the experience more tedious. If they had taken all the puzzles they had separated inside B and put it into one larger castle, I feel like you would have had a more memorable castle experience that isn't marred by the tedium of the backtracking that's required even for a casual playthrough. Next, let's touch on the game design. I think to fully understand my gripes with the level design, you have to understand my gripes with the game design. The game is just too easy. I think the biggest cause for this is the magic system, and while I say the magic system is one of the best parts about the game, it also becomes one of the worst. Magic is way too powerful in this game, and it's a shame because it's easily the coolest part of the title. Initially, it might seem more balanced, because you can't spam spells endlessly like you could in Circle of the Moon. You will actually run out of mana if you're spamming spells against a boss. But where the problem comes in is the damage output. The damage you can get from the better spells in the game is just too high. And it may sound like I'm being pretty general here, and that's because I am. I truly feel the issue persists with a majority of the spells. They're just too efficient. There are multiple bosses I've faced where I just started blowing spells on them until they died. Many of the bosses I only attempted a single time without dying, and all I really had to do was spam my spells, avoid getting hit until my mana came back. If I did get hit, pop a few potions and wait it out for my mana to restore. Half the time I didn't even need to use MP boosters to get the mana back. Maybe there's also an issue with the mana coming back too fast, now that I think about it. And much like I touched on in the last game, there are actually quite a few orbiting spells in this game that work offensively and defensively in your favor. And with so many of them in the game, it's hard not to equip them simply by accident. Almost the entirety of the wind spells are orbiting spells that are much stronger than they were in Circle of the Moon. But let's transition to another issue I've been hinting at, and that's the items. This game still has item drops, but much of the best equipment is actually found through exploration. They made a weird choice in this game to make some consumable items and armor pieces not be drops, but actually be discoverable in the landscape. And I don't mean in chests, but I just mean sitting out on the floor for you to pick up. For me, that was a weird choice because usually I expect things like this to at least be in chests. But I guess it's cool that they made sprites for all of these armor pieces that you can pick up and you can actually see what you're going to get. But it does create a strange issue here. Since some of the best items are gotten simply through exploration, that means you're not likely to ever be trailing behind in stats at any point of the game if you equip the last armor piece you picked up, because chances are that's the armor piece you need to have. Potions are also easier to come by because there's a set number of potions and high potions that are just dropped into the map as guaranteed pickups without having to worry about grinding drops from monsters. And let's not forget to mention that there is a shop, and you will run into it at some point even if you're not trying to, and you can buy potions there for cheap as well. This means you have an abundance of potions and mana restorers, so you're really rarely at a risk of dying from any general monsters in the environment, and really only come into play against the bosses. But anybody who has any level of experience with these types of games will, I believe, find these bosses to be quite easy. And I want to make it clear, I'm not trying to brag about my skill level here. On the contrary, I'm quite bad at these games. That's why I feel like it should hold some weight when I say that these bosses are pretty easy to deal with. And let's not forget to mention the abundance of backtracking you're likely to do in this game if you don't know what you're looking for. This sort of adds to the problem, because sometimes the first time you encounter a creature, it is difficult, but with so much backtracking you have to do, becoming overleveled is almost a guarantee, I would say. Since there are no easy fast travel points, you have to go through rooms with many monsters, and it becomes a simple task to equip a orbiting spell and run through them and have your orbiting spell kill them automatically without you even interacting with the monsters themselves. This leads you to racking up levels as you're simply walking through the space. which in turn makes the next boss you find a lot easier if you get lost, and kind of creates this domino effect of the game just being easier and easier. And I think of this lack of challenge from the monsters you start to get later in the game is why I think the game feels a little bit tedious. It's not that the enemies pose a challenge, I think it's that they don't pose a challenge. That makes running through the castle feel that much more like a chore. You're not even incentivized to avoid enemies because they fall to you in like 1 or 2 hits most of the time, so it's not much of a hassle to just defeat them and get the XP boost. Once you've seen all the spells, it almost feels boring, I hate to say. And the AI isn't typically challenging enough to make you feel like the monsters are a threat. Another thing I noticed when I realized we had the side A and side B gimmick is that you're offered double the amount of bosses. When I initially realized this, I was pretty excited. However, many of the bosses were so easy that I immediately started to get disappointed every time I came across one. Like I said, I beat many of these bosses without dying or using the rewind feature that the advanced collection comes paired with here. And out of all the bosses I faced, I'd say only 3 gave me any difficulty. There was a demon that if you touched it, it inflicted curse on you, which made the fight more difficult. Even with using consumable anti-curse potions, fight still was a little bit challenging. And the other 2 difficult bosses were the maximum boss and the final boss. So even though you had twice as many bosses, a lot of them end up being forgettable simply because you beat them so fast they don't leave an impression. I'm not even sure I saw the complete movesets for all of these bosses because of how quickly they fell. Another issue I find is that bosses are also less rewarding in Harmony because half of them don't even lead to unlocking any cool item or traversal upgrade. One thing I come to expect in a Metroidvania title, I should say, is that if you beat a boss, you should get something, whether that be a new traversal upgrade or a cool item. And there are certain bosses in this game where the only thing you'll get is the health restore. And it could be that some bosses were intended to be more of mini bosses, and if that's the case, they did make it easy to distinguish what were mini bosses and what were supposed to be the big threat. So I say they failed there, and on the whole, they just felt like an unrewarding experience to play through. I feel like I do have to point out here, there is a lot more content in this game than in Circle of the Moon, and I do have to commend the game for that. Circle of the Moon is one of the few Castlevania titles where you cannot play as any other character. This game does have the post-game Maxim run-through, and it's a fun little power fantasy diversion where you play as an overpowered Maxim and run through the castle and complete it. It's a feature in many Castlevania titles, and it was simply missing in Circle of the Moon. I'm glad they brought it back for this one. There are tons of utterly little details in this game that I love too, like there are certain items you have to equip that have visible features in the game world, like equipping these glasses that allow you to see well in the dark, or equipping different robes that change the color of your aura. These are tiny things that give you a reason to use equipment that has lower stats. And I think including something like that is always great for a game to have, because it lets players have more freedom to engage with the systems and not get overly worked up about things like stats. And I suppose that is a positive to this game as well. Given how easy the game is, there's a lot of freedom in how you can equip your character, and that shouldn't be overlooked, especially when equipment does offer you these differing effects. Other notable equipment I liked was adding a giant ball to the tip of your whip to give it more damage. And there's also equipable boots in the game that apparently give you an infinite jump. You have to get that from the shop, so I didn't actually manage to get that in my initial run here, but it's a cool item nonetheless. So don't take my negative stances on some of the game design to be the end all for your experience. There's definitely fun to be had in this game. Well, that said, let me get to my conclusions here. I know I've said a lot of negative things about this title, but I don't think it's a bad game. I don't think all games need to be as difficult as Dark Souls, and a Metroidvania doesn't have to be easy to traverse or tell you all of its systems up front. A lot of people have fun discovering and figuring out titles just like this and uncovering all their little secrets. For me though, this is just a title that hasn't withstood the test of time as much as some of its other contemporaries. Even though difficulty can be subjective, there are some flaws in the controls and some odd visual quirks that are hard to overlook. I think it can be useful to discuss the shortcomings of past titles to better understand what we love about games and what we want to look for in games to enjoy in the future. Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance isn't a 9 out of 10 for me, but if you're looking for a spellcasting power fantasy, or you can fight a vampire as a legendary Belmont, check out this game and tell me what you think. If I had to rate it, probably a 7 out of 10. And that's it for this video. Why not leave a like and maybe subscribe? I'll be posting videos like this periodically, so stay tuned. And if you like videos like this, why not leave a comment down below and let me know what you want to see next.